Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. This is AP European History, our live stream for today. My name is Todd Beach, and I teach AP European History at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. It's a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this is Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Lancey. I teach at Coral Gables Senior High School, which is a suburb of Miami, Florida. Happy Tuesday. I hope everybody's well. I hope everybody's staying up to date with all this new online instruction. So today we have a bunch of things in store for you. And we are going to cover, we're almost at the end of Unit 9. We are right around the corner from starting review, which is going to begin on Thursday. And we're really excited about that. We'll be starting review. Tomorrow will be our last lesson in Unit 9 as we finish out the course. So our discussion for today is going to cover 9.11, which is migration and immigration, 9.12, which is technology, and 9.13, which is globalization. We are going to be explaining the causes and effects of migration. We're going to be talking about how innovation and advances in technology influence cultural developments. And we're going to be talking about technological and cultural causes and consequences of globalization. And again, Unit 9 kind of spans after World War I and all the way into the 21st century. So we have a little bit of back and forth sometimes with that. Today, our lesson is going to cover historical thinking skills of developments and processes, contextualization, making connections, and argumentation. We'll also be doing the historical reasoning development for causation today.
Okay, thank you, Katie. So our warm-up, this is what we left you with yesterday, is this AP practice. So we know that the exam is a modified DBQ. And so every piece of skill development that we're going to be giving you from here up until May 1st is going to be so that you do well on the DBQ. That includes that this Friday, the AP exam practice will be a modified 5-document DBQ that is from period 1. And so we hope that you'll tune into that and give that a try. It's something you could, you can download the documents and then you can, time yourself and see how that goes if you wish. But for today's warm-up, we asked you to do contextualization and a claim. And the prompt is to evaluate the most significant effects of European decolonization after the Second World War. And we asked you to submit those to apvirtuallearning@gmail.com. And so, Katie, can we go to our first sample on the next slide? So this is from Zion. Zion attends Apex Friendship High School in North Carolina. And I thought this was a great response. I've highlighted, the yellow highlighting is the claim at the end, and we have contextualization first. So if you'll just follow with me, and I'll do this as a read aloud. During the period following the Second World War, a variety of measures were taken to reverse the damages that resulted from the war. Many countries, both directly and indirectly involved in World War II, began to put a vast majority of time and resources towards rebuilding neighborhoods and facilities that were destroyed by the war. As a result, imperial powers were no longer capable of maintaining their territories. This allowed for the rise of anti-colonial politicians in countries such as China and India, who led movements promoting the resistance and opposition of imperial rule. Additionally, the inhabitants of non-Western countries were calling for racial equality, undermining the feeling of superiority that many Europeans possessed. So all of that is really nice context in the introduction to bring us to the following claim, which is highlighted. Although European decolonization led to positive effects, such as the development of new countries and the strengthening of national identities in once colonized countries, deeper economic implications and the political social instability of post-colonial states represent the detrimental effects of decolonization. So it's really clear to me what you've done here, Zion. I'm looking at the claim and I have a very good idea of what your body paragraphs are going to be, and your context is really well done. So that's a great example to start with today. Next slide. This is from Sophia of Our Lady of Lourdes Academy in Miami, Florida. And by the way, Katie, she had written a nice long note saying that her school, or where she lives, is very close to Coral Gables. So just FYI.
Yes, I know many students that attend her school, so that's great.
Okay. She's also, Sophia was really honest, and she's just said, it's my first AP course. It'll be my first AP exam. I'm really nervous, but we're here to help you out, Sophia. So I hope that today's lesson and what we're going to do with your response here gives you some feedback that helps you. So Sophia writes, and please follow along again, in the early 20th century, many countries were involved in World War II. After the war ended, the land that had been taken over had been restored, and these countries were trying to get back on their feet. Throughout the years that followed the war, Europe's overseas expansion was reversed as a result, many new nations were created. The most significant effects, and so this next sentence here is her claim, the most significant effects of European decolonization after the Second World War were the Asian countries gaining in independence, Middle Eastern nations being divided, and Europeans giving Africa back previously acquired lands. So Sophia, I think your claim is really clear. You've identified what you think the effects are. You developed a line of reasoning. I know what you're going to be talking about in your body paragraphs. Your contextualization is pretty good. It's probably, Katie is going to be our question leader for our DBQ this year. And this is the contextualization piece that if I were to give you any advice, I would say we need a sentence or two more here because we have a little bit, but it's kind of generic. And so one thing to help you to think about is using that acronym GeoSprite. Can I talk about anything geographically for my context? Can I talk about something socially? Can I talk about something politically, religiously, intellectually, technologically, economically? If I can draw from anything in my Rolodex of memory about to build this context, use GeoSprite, use that tool to help you in the contextualization. I think your claim is excellent. I think you would probably write a really nice essay there. So thank you, Sophia. In our next one, this is from Moana, and Moana attends high school at Ernest Manning High School in Alberta, Canada. She had also wrote a nice note to us, and Moana is originally from Algeria. And so I really found her take and her ideas about decolonization really interesting. So Moana writes, after European decolonization, one of the most significant effects was the impact it had for the colonies. The colonies were not prepared for their departure and did not have the necessary infrastructure to create a proper working government. After decades or even centuries of generally militaristic rule over an occupied nation, nations with little internal ties or similarities aside from their imperialist masters, who vaguely drew the lines on the map with little to no regard on geography or peoples when they settled who controlled what. After the departure, many colonies had splintered as differing nationalities drove them apart. They were left without much experience or infrastructure in government, which often led to civil wars and the rise of dictators. That part, up to that point, is really well done for context. Next, despite the European powers having officially decolonized and freed their colonies, much of their influence had still remained, allowing them to keep a foothold that also allowed criminal activity like smuggling of important resources to occur. So Moana, I think the claim that you're making there that begins at despite is really well done. It's a little implicit, but it would certainly pass and get the point. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is when you're getting ready to make the claim is to use that language again. The most significant effects of European decolonization were, and then really cue the reader, here's what I'm going to argue. Now, if we weren't writing, we think about our audience when we're writing. So we're writing for an exam for an audience and it's timed. And so we just want to be really direct and really explicit. And it isn't to say that if we're writing to a different audience for a different purpose, that this would be really good because it's really subtle the way you've done it and you wove it in there. I think it's really complex. Okay. So I hope, Moana, that is helpful feedback and hope it's helpful feedback for everybody. Really nice job with the decolonization claim, context and claim, and the evaluative cause, the evaluated task rather. Okay. Next slide.
Great, Todd. And you actually took that right out of my mouth. I was going to repeat what you said about, I really like it when the students are using the terms in the question to come back to as they're making their claim. I think it helps keep them really focused. And I think it's a good best practice for students to be doing as we move forward. So as we're talking about the decolonization and some of the effects of decolonization, one of them is certainly this idea of post-World War II migration from former territories into Europe. We're going to see that migration takes place both within countries and across national borders. We have many countries that still have underdeveloped rural areas, and those areas are left with declining job prospects. A lot of times people will leave and go to more urban areas and more developed regions in their own countries. We're going to see that in countries like Spain, where people are going to move from one area to another to seek jobs. We're also going to have, because of the economic growth after World War II in the 50s and 60s, migrant workers from Southern Europe, Spain, countries like Italy, are going to leave and go to the more prosperous Western and Central Europe. We're going to see Asia and Africa also, or a lot of guest workers in leaving Turkey, going to places like West Germany that we'll talk about in a minute. But we do see this movement that happens after World War II. Countries like West Germany, who have these significant losses of life in World War II, need to replace those people to have jobs filled. So they are going to implement guest worker programs to recruit labor. And by the 1970s, foreign guest workers from Southern European countries and Northern Africa makes up about 12% of the workforce in West Germany and France, two countries that took in a lot of guest workers after decolonization, and as their prosperity that's happening is going to require more jobs. So after World War II, we're going to see this wave of decolonization, a movement of people from former colonies back to Europe to try to avail themselves of that prosperity. And immigrant labor will fuel that economic recovery. And we're also going to see a huge change in the maps of these countries. We're going to see diversity, and we're going to see an enriched cultural life because of this. However, and actually, let's go back real quick. I wanted to show the picture that's there. And that's just a picture in France of immigrant workers. And it's important to talk about that these immigrant workers didn't always receive a warm welcome. And that gets us to this visual. It's a really powerful visual. It's from an old DBQ, but students of mine are often really surprised to find out that this is from 1991, when we are still obviously struggling with many of these issues right now. So this is the cover of a French magazine, the Figaro magazine. And we have the image of Marianne, which is the personification of the French woman at the time, and actually, post-French Revolution. And they're silhouetted by a veiled Muslim woman. And the cover reads, "Immigration or invasion? Take our poll and you can decide." And so we do see that cultural diversity, that religious diversity that comes because of this wave of migration has sometimes negative effects for the immigrants themselves. So these immigrants were not always welcome. Many faced discrimination in finding jobs and housing, and groups of immigrants would frequently live in separate communities. In these communities, they would speak their own language. They'd be quite separate from the cities that they immigrated to. And after the economic downturn of the 1970s, these workers and their families often became targets of anti-immigrant feelings and extreme nationalist political parties. And Todd's going to talk about a couple examples of those parties in our next part here. And these right-wing parties opposed immigration. They argued that immigrants taxed state resources and stole jobs from native-born Europeans, and they're kind of particularly referring to white Europeans. They began winning seats in the 1980s, claiming to champion ordinary workers and calling for a return to, quote, traditional national customs. And this will really alienate immigrants, who are a diverse and growing segment of the population here.
Thank you, Katie. This is going to stack on what she has started for us here. So ethnic diversity in contemporary Europe. And let's begin with the source, the image on the right. So this is since the beginning of 2015, the number of migrants using the so-called Balkans route has exploded, with migrants arriving in Greece from Turkey and then traveling on through Macedonia and Serbia before entering the EU through Hungary. The number of people leaving their homes in war-torn countries such as Syria marks the largest migration of people since World War II. And so Europe is dealing with this migration of peoples who, and they're trying to just, you see them carrying their families. They are simply looking for a better life. If they were refugees from Syria, they're trying to avoid war-torn areas, and they don't want to live in refugee tents. They're trying to make their way. And so here you see them traveling along the way to try and get into Western Europe. So in the A paragraph, as the 21st century opened and ongoing globalization transformed European society and politics, Europeans also saw the ethnic makeup of their communities change. And so part of this is to understand the causes and the effects of this change that we're seeing taking place. So Europe experienced itself a remarkable decline in birth rates, and it results from the aging population. And there's a shift in social norms. More women are choosing careers. They're waiting longer to have children and families. Some are choosing not to have children at all and choosing their careers first. And so what we're seeing of the native populations in Western Europe is a decline in birth rates. In the C paragraph, at the same time, then the peaceful, wealthy European Union is going to attract a rapidly growing number of refugees and immigrants from the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In D, a new and different surge of migration into Western Europe began in the 1990s, as we have talked about with the collapse of communism, the civil wars in Yugoslavia, conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Rwanda, and as I mentioned, most recently Syria. Thousands of refugees are making their way into Europe, and especially Western Europe. Many of them seek political asylum, but eventually they get rejected for that claim, and they'll be classified as illegal job seekers. So they are in the country technically illegally, but they're not leaving, and they're having a hard time finding work. And so, what does that leave for them? And that brings us to F. Organized crime will continue to prey upon this population because they're desperate. They'll prey upon them for their labor, and they force some into prostitution. Next slide, please. So take a look at this source here. This is a view of a bus that was destroyed by a bomb in Woburn Place. It's near Russell Square in London. This took place on July 7th, 2005. Up to 50 people were killed, 700 injured during a morning rush hour terrorist attacks that took place. So I was in London on this day. I was very near that bus because I was studying at a library called the Education Library at the University of London. And it was a strange day, eerie day in London that day. But let's get to why these things are occurring. So in the A paragraph, for centuries, the number of foreigners living in Europe had been relatively small. Now, permanently displaced ethnic groups or diasporas brought ethnic diversity to the continent. I will say that I believe London to be one of the most diverse cities in the world, no question. So B, the multiculturalism and ethnic diversity associated with globalization have contributed to the cultures through food, literature, film, fine arts, and it's enriched European culture. And in C, Europe's Muslim residents have been living under a cloak of suspicion that accelerated with the rise of Islamic extremists, especially after Al-Qaeda attacks in the US on September 11th. There was a train bombing in Madrid carried out by Moroccan Muslims that were living in Spain in 2004, and the attack by Pakistan. These are British citizens of Pakistani descent, and that attack took place in London on July 7th, 2005. It took place in the London Underground and in this bus explosion that you see there. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the source now, the image you see. These are 3 school-age friends that take a selfie. They are young women are second generation North Africans. They live in Paris in 2017, and they look very much like young people you'd be going to school with today. There's no question. And so A, the vast majority of Europe's Muslims clearly support democracy, reject violent extremism, but the attacks have sharpened the European debate on immigration. So B, secular Europeans at times struggle to understand the depths of Muslim spirituality. In France, there are attempts to enforce a ban on wearing the hijab in public schools, and that just creates more tension between Western secularism and Islamic religiosity. C, immigration is a highly charged political issue that has given rise to far-right populist politics and parties Some of those parties are like the National Front in France, the Danish People's Party, Austria's Freedom Party. And so we're seeing this, and it still exists today, this great tension that's taking place about what does French culture look like today. And then D, many second and third generation Muslim immigrants argue that they are outcasts in their adopted countries. To them, economics, inadequate job training, and discrimination have a lot more influence on their attitudes than did religious or extremist teachings. And so if these groups continue to feel marginalized, it's going to continue to add to the tension that's taking place in Europe at this time.
Okay, so I want you to remember that this particular unit sort of spans the whole of the 20th century. So in some of the issues from immigration, we just brought that pretty much almost to current. But now we step back for some of the stuff that we're going to do moving forward in this lesson, and we're going back to post-World War II. And so there's this idea of big science. And as part of the arms race of the Cold War, this competition that the two sides are going to have to continue to outdo each other, big science is going to emerge. It's going to combine engineering and theoretical work. It's extremely expensive. And so we often see it financed by large corporations, and governments will finance this work to try to build up their arms stock and to create more sophisticated and destructive weapons. After 1945, about a quarter of all men and women with science and engineering backgrounds will be immersed in this arms race. And by 1960, the nuclear stockpiles of both the US and the Soviet Union are significant enough that they can destroy each other many times over. From this technological and weapon-oriented stockpiles, we're gonna see space become competition. This is gonna be that the space race begins after the Soviet Union puts the first man-made satellite into orbit, Sputnik. This is gonna be a huge blow to sort of the nationalism of the US. And there will be a concentrated effort to catch up and surpass the Soviet Union. Right after the Soviet Union put Sputnik into space in 1957, we will see the formation of NASA and a concentrated, verbalized effort to compete and land a manned craft on the moon by 1969, which the US does. World War II is also going to stimulate the search for better weapons and showcase the need to have machines to process data, computers. So we're going to see the beginning of this. We will see sophisticated computers being built for breaking German codes. And from that, we will see computers used in military, commercial, and scientific applications. And it's going to foreshadow the computer age that we're going to enter after this. And if you can see on the right, there is a British computer that's built during World War, and I'm sorry, that's a mistake, it should be World War II, that was the Colossus used to break German codes. And of course, now we're all walking around with computers in our hands, right? So that's, we've come a long way since then. All right, Todd.
Great, thank you, Katie. The activity we're going to start with today for guided practice is just making connections skill 5. So this is going to be 5B, explain how a historical development or process relates to another historical development or process. And so I give you this question or this task at the bottom on the left. Explain how political unrest in other parts of the world affect the everyday lives of Europeans. And so the source that we would give you is here on the right from the Pew Research Center. They put out really good graphics, so I appreciated this one. And the title of it up here, it says more than 2/3 of Europe's unauthorized immigrants in 2017 lived in Germany, the UK, Italy, and France. And so you can see the chart on the right of the different European countries and the different types of populations. So if the headline has told us that Germany, UK, Italy, and France. So let's look over on the right and find Germany, UK, Italy, France, and you see the numbers there to help you orientate you to the numbers, okay? Those means that there's more than 2/3. Those are the ones that are a positive number in those countries. And then they also give you the coloring that helps as well. You can see those countries in blue have the heaviest population of unauthorized immigrants. And so what your task would be is, why are these immigrants coming here? What are the effects of something else that's taking place in other parts of the world that connects them to going to these areas in Europe. Why those areas and where did they come from? So I'll give you a minute just to jot down some ideas you have about what caused that connection, the causal aspect. How are they connected? And thinking about, we just brought you through refugees. We've just brought you through the idea of no jobs and looking for better life. So civil wars that are taking place, forcing these migrations here, but why then? What's the connection to Italy, France, Germany, UK? And that part about the why those places probably has to do more with what are the laws in these countries, that are they more friendly toward immigrants, or the immigrants that are coming in, these refugees are coming in, may know someone that is already in one of these countries. So that would be our connection in that activity. But this is a kind of a document you would see like on a DBQ. You're going to get one visual on that 5-document DBQ when you have your exam. And so we have to be able to read statistical documents, maps, visuals, and make those connections. Okay. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Next
That's
slide,
great,
Katie.
Matt. Love that. Okay, so again, we've come back to the second half of the 20th century, and we have this idea of the consumer revolution. We're going to see in that the growing economy of Western Europe is going to lead to a rising standard of living and an increase in consumer goods. When we have money, people want to spend it, right? So we will see massive increases in the production and availability of consumer goods, and this will stimulate mass consumption. People are expecting to have goods like televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, music systems, and cars as a basic requirement. Prior to World War II, many of these items had been seen as very luxurious, available only to the most privileged sections of society. And we'll also see and see that people are starting to buy these items on credit. Goods will be purchased using installment plans. There will be banks and credit unions that issue loans for these consumer purchases, which allow people to pay for things over time. By the 1960s, we start to see consumption becoming less concerned with utilitarian needs and more to do with status and comfort. And this is really very much about the society being quite economically prosperous. We will also see, and I'll talk a little bit about this in counterculture, that youth is going to become a recognized commercial group, and we will see goods that are targeted and marketed straight to the youth. And this idea that the youth are going to want to separate themselves from the adult world and express their own identity. And we will also see that images of consumerism will become propaganda for the Cold War. We will see both sides their citizens with ample consumer goods, both of them stressing the superiority of their particular economic ideology to be able to provide people with things that they want. And if you see on the right, there's this wonderful ad from England in 1961 for the Morris Mini Motor, the family happily in the car. I like that we've got the kids in the back. And this is just sort of what a new family is looking to acquire. These are no longer luxury goods, but rather what every family should have and deserves to have. And this goes right into yours, Todd.
Yeah, I stack onto what you're talking about with this affluent society. I love this image. It's from the streets of Rome, and actually it just says this old small red, red small vintage car, but that's just such a very much a present day image. If you travel to Rome, this is a pretty common scene actually. So it stacks on the consumer side of the affluent society. Economic growth, high wages meant that we have an expanding middle class that could enjoy the benefits of the consumer revolution that begins in the 1950s. I want to pause here because we're going to talk about globalization tomorrow, and we'll get a little bit of it today, but we see what you need to look at, thinking about change over time. Here's what we're seeing in the 1950s and 60s, an affluent society and exploding consumerism. And then how does that change with this same social group once we get to globalization? So kind of hold that in your mind as we're working through this. So B, the age of affluence. did not include everyone. The living standards of workers and immigrants did not rise as fast as those of the educated middle classes, and the expanded economy did not reach underdeveloped regions. C, many Europeans have more time to spend on more leisure time, recreational pursuits. And one of the most noticeable leisure time developments was the blossoming of mass travel and tourism, facilitated by month-long paid vacations, widespread automobile ownership. You still see quite a bit of that in Europe. August is definitely not a time, if you are traveling to Europe, August is probably the time to avoid it, because that's when many Europeans go and take holiday. And these month-long paid vacations, they really enjoy that. Next slide, please. This, let's take a look at the source first, because we're going to move from affluent society to talking about changes that are also causing some of this affluence, and also, I don't know, they're kind of political changes as well. But take a look at the source. This is the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican closing ceremony, St. Peter's Square, 9th of December, 1965. And so we're going to talk about in the B paragraph, but it's the Second Vatican Council and what that means for Catholics. In A, the moral authority of religious doctrine lost ground before the growing materialism of consumer society. In other words, we had kind of this moral compass that religion was helping to hold to, and now we're starting to see a more secular division of materialism. In predominantly Protestant lands, church membership and regular attendance starts to decline. And in B, at the Second Vatican Council, which convened from 62 to 65, Catholic leaders are initiating a number of reforms meant to democratize the church, broaden its appeal, including saying masses in local languages, and embracing a new openness in Catholic theology. So up until 1965, before Vatican II, as they called it, the Mass was still said in Latin no matter where you lived. You could be living in New York and the Mass would be spoken in Latin. And after Vatican II, then the vernacular language, or language of the people, the local language, became part of the Mass. And this is an attempt to make it more appealing, more open, more understood by people, and so that church attendance does not decline. C, family ties were weakened in the age of affluence. Men and women tend to marry later, and the nuclear family became smaller, more mobile. Divorce rates rose rapidly, and the number of adults living alone grew remarkably during this time. And by the 1970s, the post-war baby boom was over, population growth leveled out across Europe, and even began to decline in Northwestern Europe.
Okay, so you mentioned baby boomers. We're going to talk for a minute about the counterculture movement. And so that is really the baby boomers that come of age. Along with an affluent society will come this youth counterculture. Baby boomers grow up in a society of abundance. They're surrounded by political liberalism and these ideas of national identity that accompanied and followed decolonization. And these baby boomers are coming of age in the 1960s amid problems of inequality and social injustice. In Western Europe, they're very much inspired and influenced by the American Civil Rights Movement. We will see that inspiring youth to this progressive activism. And the activism will be to reform, to change what's going on in their existing political and power structures. So a lot of times we think about the 60s here in the United States, but it's important that Western European countries really followed much of that same activism that we saw here in the US. Youth sit-ins will happen and protests, again, borrowing from the American Civil Rights Movement methods. And we will see new forms of Marxism that come in, known as the New Left. And they're really seeking to sort of equalize society in a significant way. And then along with this counterculture movement, also in the US and Western Europe, we have this lifestyle of rebellion and a sexual revolution that comes about. And one of the really important reasons is for the marketing and easy access to the birth control pill. So that's a huge moment where this is going to facilitate things that are going on in the 60s. We're going to see new ideas and acceptance of things like premarital sex and homosexuality, and just sort of a revolution in thought because of this generation of youth that has grown up in the affluence post-World War II.
Okay, this slide is meant to kind of set you up for tomorrow and contextualizing globalization. Tomorrow's lesson is going to be a little bit of globalization at the first part, and then we're going to be doing art and architecture kind of the 1900s as well. So it's kind of a I don't know, a miscellaneous group of things that we're putting together that are in that last unit, that last segment of the unit. So what is globalization? And so I'm just going to begin with this image. The financial stock exchange market displays screen board on a street in Hong Kong from 2016. And so we need to really define what is globalization. What does that mean? So the world enters this era of globalization. While Europe has long had international connections, sometimes productive, sometimes destructive, new global relationships and increasing interdependence did emerge in the last decades of the 20th century. Interdependence, that word, we depend on each other within this structure, and it's going to be an economic structure of dependence. So B, the causes include the growth of these multinational corporations and a restructured national economies. And so the key that's tying, the thing that's the thread holding all this together is an economic thread. Let's make sure that we're really clear about that. So two, next, the emergence of an array of international governing bodies. So there is the European Union, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization. There are lots of these non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, that increasingly set policies that challenge the autonomy of traditional nation states. So in other words, we have these huge conglomerates, and if you are France and you want to be a trader and to get involved with the World Trade Organization, that's great, but there are certain policies that we're going to dictate to you that you have to adhere to. So in three, finally, the access and the growth of highly efficient computer and media technologies to facilitate an ever faster exchange of information and entertainment around the world. So this slide is just meant to give you a taste and to give us, just a little bit of understanding, contextualization, because tomorrow is where we'll dive deeper into what's causing globalization. We get a little bit of that here, but what are the effects of globalization? Are the effects positive? Are they negative? And how would you structure an argument about that? And that will be what we talk about tomorrow.
That's great.
Okay, so today our key takeaways, we want to talk about cause effects of changes to migration within and immigration to Europe throughout the period after World War II. We want to talk about advances in technology that influence cultural and intellectual developments. We're going to talk about technological and cultural causes and consequences of globalization. So that last one, we just contextualized that today. We'll get into more causes and consequences tomorrow. And the reasoning skills we did were developments and processes. That's obviously what we took you through. Contextualization and the argumentation, that was the practice that we had you do. And the connections was the guided activity. And throughout then, we were talking about causes today.
And I'm going to add on a little bit about sourcing here, because I've come back to that again for your exam practice. Remembering that these are 2 out of the 10 points on the rubric for the DBQ that you're going to take now in May. And we are going to continue to focus on the different things that can help you practice getting those points. And I'm really excited to give you a full DBQ to practice over the weekend on Friday. So we have
Katie,
here.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no.
The sourcing is actually going to be 3 points. They can get 3 points on the DBQ if they source. Excuse me, you're right. It's 2 points for the sourcing. I'm looking at the evidence from documents. My gosh, we're still getting familiar with the rubric.
No worries. So again, because this is, a fifth of the points, I think it's certainly worth practicing. And this is a short document, and it goes back to what I talked about at the beginning of the lesson when we're looking at the reactions to migration. And the source here is Jacques Lang, the French Minister of Culture, in a speech to United Nations Conference in Mexico City, 1982. So read along with me. Culture and economy, one and the same battle. I ask myself, why should we accept this homogenization? Is this really mankind's destiny? The same films, the same music, the same clothes? We wish to proclaim a real cultural revolt, to embark on a crusade against, let's call it by its name, against the financial and intellectual imperialism of globalization. So we have here, when we think about the things that we've contextualized with Todd today on globalization, I want you to think about what the argument is that Lang is making in this document. And then I'd like you for your homework today to share with us your sourcing, your happy, as you can see up at the top. And you guys did a really great job the last time I gave you one of these. Sometimes I know that this particular skill feels a little awkward as you're including this to bolster your argument. And I think that it really becomes easier when you practice it. So if you can look at who our gentleman is and what kind of document it is and when they're making the document, and think about how you would source this document. And as always, send your responses to apeurovirtuallearning@gmail.com, and we will feature some of these tomorrow. And I'm gonna go ahead and say again, we just continue to be so impressed with your work and your dedication to getting better at these skills. And we're hoping to give you practice throughout the next 4 weeks or so.
This is a message from College Board. We know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity, or if you know someone who does, please reach out to College Board at cb.org/tech.
All right.
I just want to stack on what you were saying, Katie, about the responses we get from students. We read through all those. I really like them. Like Sophia's response today. I love her honesty about, I'm nervous. This is my first exam. I want some feedback. I just thank you for being so honest. And we're doing our very best to look through and read those and give you some really good feedback. And as a generic way, we obviously can't get to everybody's, but I just think it's really cool that you're doing that.
Absolutely. Well, everyone be well. Again, tomorrow is our last lesson from Unit 9 before we start review. A shout out to my wonderful students who are going to have a lesson right after this. I miss you so much. And a shout out, I get to do it today, to Sarah, our wonderful producer who's on here and who we love talking to. We get to chit chat with her in the morning, and it's been really nice getting to know her. We appreciate all of her support and feedback. All right,
Katie,
well, everyone have a great day.
I can't help but notice that you're in a different setting. What's behind you through that window?
I am. Well, I was going to go outside so you could have the ocean behind me. I'm down in the Florida Keys, but now you just have a window because the lighting didn't work at all. But maybe I'll try to give you a quick shot tomorrow if I can make it work.
Great. Hey, everybody, have a great day. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.